Good morning and welcome to our Navigating the Blizzard webinar series presented by Sadar Group. My name is Roger Hitchcock. I'm a senior partner at Sadar Group, and we really want to take this opportunity to stand together with everybody. We understand these are really trying times, but thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending the time, taking the time. And I trust that this morning we'll be able to spend a bit of time, invest that time, as I mentioned, thinking about how do we protect, preserve, sustain our businesses through this time, as well as how do we think about the value that we can unlock and the value that we can create, not only for ourselves but also for others. And I think that's our primary purpose of this set of series, set of webinar series. As we said last time, as a blizzard engulfs the whole globe, it's critical to maintain a clear head and address the right issues in the right way. And the issue we're going to talk about today is talking about the relationships within our business. But again, to lay a foundation, we want to help you, and this webinar is designed to help you take the next steps in your business. Today, I would like to try to answer the question, who do you pick up the phone to when this webinar is finished? Who do you take action with? Who do you, we can't meet physically, but who do you set up a Zoom call with? And what do you talk about? And so we want to help you determine the next steps to take in your business. Think through the implications and impact of these steps as practically as possible. Take the decisions in a responsible but effective way. The challenges, there are huge decisions to be made during this time. And then position yourselves to see this thing through. As I put at the bottom there, these are designed to be working webinars. And what I suggest you get is a piece of paper. We're going to be workshopping some things in the next hour or so, and spending time, as I said, answering those questions. Who should you be picking up the phone to, and what should you be talking about? To lay a bit of a foundation as well, I'm going to spend a bit of time talking through some foundational thinking so that we can understand the context and the objective of strategic relationships and engaging strategically with our stakeholders, but also the one concept that is critical and a phrase that I'm starting to see people use and I'm trying to use myself is, what does this look like on the other side? I think that's going to be a phrase that we have to keep in mind. There is another side to this thing. And so in our thinking, and this was unpacked briefly in the first webinar, if you need to go back and listen, it's called liminal thinking. It's talking about seeing what we're going through as a threshold and a period of transition. And as we approach a threshold, and the word liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold or doorway, we've got to understand, how do we approach this thing? What is our approach and preparation? When we're talking about stakeholders, what do we have to think about so we can identify which stakeholders to talk to when and what conversations to have? And then we've obviously got to take the action. We've got to create accountability in our businesses. We've got to take accountability if we're the ones to follow through with the action. And as we go through it, we then will be able to look and leave it and ask ourselves the question, what will things look like on the other side? We are seeing a massive clampdown and lockdown around the world. Many of us have been sitting in our own homes, and to share just personally, my wife and I, we're accounting for the number of times we've been out, and in the last week, I think I've been out of the house 2 or 3 times. We've obviously had to shop. We've bought groceries for elderly members of our family. At the same time, we've had difficult decisions to make. We've have a family wedding that a lot of us are not able to go to, and so we're trying to explore ways to participate virtually via this kind of platform. And so it's not only clamping us and constraining us, but it's forcing us to think of new things. And one of the key concepts in business that has emerged over the last 10, 15, 20 years even is this concept of stakeholder engagement, stakeholder inclusivity, what I call stakeholdership, which seems to be a word that is coming up more and more and more. And so we want to unpack what does it mean. Firstly, to reframe our thinking. I think we've often thought about our businesses in a limited way, and I want to try to expand our thinking in terms of that. And then, as I said, I'm going to spend some time unpacking some very, very practical tools. That's where you're going to need the pen and paper to identify key steps and actions to take going forward. in reframing our thinking, we've often thought of our businesses as a combination of these two things. And most of the times we think of business as a combination of our assets and activities, what we have and what we do. And obviously people fit in there somewhere, but it's people arranged, you know, they are either linked, and we measure our businesses in terms of what we have, our balance sheets and our income statements, and what we do, performance management, key performance indicators. But what is emerging more and more critically, and at this time, is that the foundational element of our business and the thing that ties those two things together are the relationships in the business. And so even as we go through this webinar, I would like you to start thinking of names and faces, because business is not just about what we have and what we do, but it's about who we're linked with. A phrase I often use is that we need to better understand the relational landscape or the relational geography that we operate in. Because some of the relationships in your businesses, looking over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months and into the future, are going to be critical to your sustainability and your survival. There are going to be some relationships in business that you're going to need to let go of. There are going to be some relationships that are going to be new and you need to cling to and work with. And so in reframing our businesses as a first foundation stone of this stakeholdership thinking is to understand that it's not just about what we have and what we do, but it's about who we're related to and who we're linked to. And to put it another way, we've often thought about our businesses as follows. We've often thought about it from a foundational point of view and asking ourselves what's foundational. And we've often put our assets as, you know, that layer. We've then said our activities rest upon that. And so we have our actions or our activities. But actually what I'm trying to say is that the thing that undergirds all of that is our relationships. And so stakeholder engagement is a term that has become a little bit passé. We think about stakeholders, we hear it a lot used in the political space, we speak about it a lot in the business space, but ultimately relationships are foundational. You wouldn't have a business if there weren't relationships and other parties that you could relate to. And that's quite critical to think about at this time, because foundational to the success and sustainability of your business going forward and the businesses you're involved in is going to be understanding and better resting on, in inverted commas, making use of, relying on, you know, using, again in inverted commas, the relationships in the business. And the key thing that encourages me during a time like this, and I tend to be an optimist, but the thing that encourages me during this time is that we are seeing a resurgence in thinking about relationships from the videos we're seeing coming out of Spain and Italy about people on their balconies, you know, singing songs together, people applauding the healthcare workers, the police, you know, changing the way they deal, neighbors, you know, sure, staying across the road from one another, but asking how they can help, reaching out to one another. And I do think that there is an opportunity to reach out. Those of you who have businesses that are strong, that are sustainable, that are able to survive, think about how you can reach out and help others. Those of you whose businesses are looking shaky at this time, it's time to reach out. And I want to read an article that I read, that I picked up this weekend. It's a small Italian restaurant that, you know, took an opportunity to think outside the box. The headline was called, and it comes from Inc. magazine, a small Italian restaurant decided to offer takeout. Then it did something truly unexpectedly thoughtful. And it goes on to say that it's tough. And so the email they sent out to all of their patrons, they said, like many restaurants, we're going to be providing takeout food for the community now. I hope business will be enough to justify staying open, as this is new territory for us. So this was a restaurant that had never done takeaway meals. They went on to say, I want to assure you, the name of the company is Valentini, that Valentini & Co. is one of the cleanest food facilities around. In fact, on our last Department of Health inspection, we scored 100% perfect. Furthermore, our dishwashing machine is state of the art. So they put a couple of paragraphs in there to just satisfy and, you know, provide peace of mind. And I think one of the things we can be thinking about is how do we provide peace of mind to our customers, our suppliers, that we're doing what it takes. I've been to a couple of businesses. One of the meetings I had was a business last week in the construction industry, and they were saying in South Africa that there's a wide range of different responses. Some are not taking it as seriously as they should, others are. And so people are thinking about who they want to deal with during this time. And then this restaurant went a little bit further and said, I would also like to offer you more help. I would like to offer help to those who are in need of items that have disappeared from store shelves. And as we know, there's been lots of panic buying all over the world. Things like toilet paper, hand towels, bleach, sponges, and many more items that restaurants normally use. If we have it, we'll give you some of ours at cost. Just ask. And that's an incredible gesture. And as I said, we also have a sanitizer mixing machine. If you bring your own bottle, we can fill it up free of charge. This is not for hand sanitizing, but is a very effective on hard surfaces and doesn't smell as bad as bleach. And so here's an example of a restaurant that said, okay, so we have to do a whole lot of things. We have some of our assets, but how can we use those, what we do and what we have, to serve the relationships in our businesses? So that's reframing our businesses with stakeholders in mind. A quote that I've often used as well as this one, that governance is concerned with holding the balance between economic and social goals and individual and communal goals. And so in thinking about our businesses, and again, I want you to think about names and faces. Who are the people who represent in your business the social goals, the communities you're involved in, the economic goals? Now, often we see that as just the shareholder role, but actually your business has an economic relationship with a range of other businesses. There are suppliers you buy from. Their businesses are going to be at risk if you cannot buy from them. There are customers who obviously pay you. How do you facilitate that relationship? There's the communal. In other words, what are we doing together? How are we tying our teams together, building our teams together internally and externally? And then obviously there's the individual. And right now individuals are going through lots and lots of challenging thinking. Families are having discussions they've never had before. People are spending time often in constrained, restricted places and getting frustrated. Some people have no choice but to travel to work. And we'll see changes over the next few days, I think, that'll put a lot of things in the spotlight of how we do business and how we run our business. But ultimately, it's about the relationships that we are part of. Another foundation stone, and maybe more technical, but there's a King 4 is the Code of Corporate Governance in South Africa. And this is often thought of as for big businesses, but we've got to think about it in our own businesses, and what does this actually mean for us? And the things I want to highlight in this. So the principle is that in the execution of its governance roles and responsibilities, the governing body, that's the board of a company or the decision makers in a company. And when I say board, I'm thinking about governing thinking. If your company doesn't have a formal board, it is still being governed, but it is being governed out of your decision making as a governance, especially strategic decision making as a governance responsibility. The governing body should adopt a stakeholder inclusive approach, and I'll unpack on the next slide what that means, that balances the needs, interests, and expectations of material stakeholders in the best interests of the organization over time. To highlight a couple of the points in this quote, and it's challenging, but we do have to think about our companies that we govern. We've got to think about what is in the best interests of the organization over time. That is our primary responsibility as directors. It's put in stark light in the current situation, because at the same time, we have to think about what people need. What are their key interests in the business? And that's often a legal interest or a specific interest in the business. And then what are people expecting of us during this time? Our stakeholders, as I've said in the first couple of slides, are foundational to our success and sustainability as a business. And so we have to think about them. And so there is this tension. And what we're going through is putting the light on one of the most challenging paradoxes that we have in business, is that there are these various parties, as I said, pulling us in opposite directions. All right. And there's a lot more than just those four. There's a whole lot of them. And yet at the same time, we have to think about how do we sustain this thing called the company that we are accountable for as directors. And that's essentially the challenge that King 4 puts before us. How do we identify the needs, interests, and expectations and do something about it? And what that means practically is what I call governing with impact in mind. And to think about your business consists of various policies, procedures, all of these things that we do to govern, need to now, more than ever before, take impact into mind. And the impact of our businesses comes from what we do. Those activities that we spoke about, and obviously the assets of the business that are managed. And so we've got to think about what is the impact of our actions. But actions in business come from the decisions of the decision makers in the business. And so the way we delegate and the way we manage or govern, the flow between decisions and actions becomes absolutely critical in our business. And so more so than ever before, we have to think about this leg, that there is a flow right through from decisions to impact. And that's also why the liability of directors, based on the impact of our decisions, rests on decision makers, and not just on the actions of the company. But underlying our decisions is the way, sorry to take a step back, that side of the, that leg of the equation we govern with our policy framework. It's how we take, policy framework effectively takes decisions into actions and actions into impact. And so in this time, we have to think about how do we reframe our policy framework to take impact into account when we decide. And on the other side of the other leg of this model is to say that underlying our decisions is our thinking. So our decisions reflect our thinking. And the challenge with boards is that it's not individual thinking. It's group thinking. It's thinking together. It's making decisions together and not one person carrying the load. And our thinking also reflects our values. And so the values of the business, the values of the team, the values of those involved in the business are reflected in the way we think and how we come to decisions. And that side of that leg of the model is where board process comes into play. And so we often think of this two being the same thing, but actually our board process, the way how often we meet, what we talk about during this time, there is going to be need to meet more often, talk about deeper things, and change the way that our decisions are made. If we've just gone through the motions, we have to think deeper. We have to question and challenge our values, because ultimately the impact that we have reflects the values of the business. And that's in stark light of day in today's crisis. What is going to become more and more evident are the values of the business. And so even that example of that restaurant that is obviously doing whatever it can, decisions, actions, impact, to survive and to be sustainable, it's also thinking, how do we reach out to our community? How do we do things that make a difference? And one of the key concepts or key questions to ask as we go through the balance, and those are the foundation stones, but as we go through the balance of this webinar, is to ask the question, where's the empty chair around your boardroom table? Whose voice aren't we hearing? And I'm thinking that most of the board will be full, but there's a chair that is a different color, a chair that reflects a different view. And in our boards, we often don't take into account that other view, the view from outside, the view from our stakeholders. And so even as we're going through decision making in our businesses, I want you to ask the question, even as we go through the balance of this webinar, who should be sitting in that seat, or who is sitting in that seat? Names, faces, who should we be picking the phone up to? What should we be speaking to them about? And those are the two questions that I want to try to help you answer in the balance of this webinar. And that's what we mean when we say strategic stakeholder engagement. It sounds like a fancy term and a title, and it sounds very technical, but actually strategic stakeholder engagement helps us answer the two questions. Who should I be picking up the phone to next? And I do suggest we pick up the phone to people. I do suggest that we speak as far as is possible face to face, and the technology is amazing in today's world that you can actually look someone in the eye from 1,000 kilometers away. And what should I be talking to them about? What should we be addressing? And I think there are some tough conversations on Friday evening. This last Friday evening, my wife and I decided that we would still continue to do our normal Friday thing. We took care, but we get takeaways on a Friday evening normally because we're quite exhausted. And so I went to the establishment that we normally get them from, and the manager of the business happened to be sitting there at 8 o'clock in the evening and going through his paperwork. And I said, "How's it going?" And he said, "It's tough." And he asked me a couple of questions about, what should we be doing? And I said, well, maybe you need to be grouping together as a group of renters in this mall. He was and go to the landowner and say, who can I speak to about making a plan? And how do we go together? What should we be talking? Because he actually asked me the question, should I be speaking to my landlord? And I said, if you haven't spoken to your landlord already, then now's the time to do it, or maybe Monday morning. And so what we want to do in this balance is to unpack parts of what I call the stakeholder engagement toolbox. And there are obviously lots and lots and lots of tools that one can use. But I want to introduce you to 2 or 3 key concepts about stakeholders, again, with the view to answering the question, who should you be speaking to next and what about? And the first one of those tools is what we call stakeholder mapping. And the idea of stakeholder mapping is to answer the question, where should we be spending our time and attention, time and money? Where should we be investing? All right. And how do we bring stakeholders into the decision-making process? Because right now, there are going to be some very, very loud voices. And a quote that I heard a number of years ago is that the loudest voice isn't always the most important voice. And so what we want to be doing is identifying who the most important voices are in the stakeholder engagement process, as opposed to just saying, let's respond. Because the danger is we can now simply get into responsive mode instead of taking proaction and being proactive in our stakeholder engagement process. And the best metaphor I have for stakeholder engagement and the challenges is that it's often seen as something we do going forward, but actually engagement is about a two-way process. And I'm always reminded when I talk about stakeholder mapping that it's like a rugby scrum, where in today's rugby match, those of you who know, before a scrum goes down, everybody gets into position. There's a preparation phase where everybody gets together and takes their position up. Then there's this touch phase where the props reach out and touch one another to kind of gain distance, gain, what are we going to go into? It's that assessment phase of where is the stakeholder, which is an important one to think about. And then there's this pause. In other words, are we ready? And then the word engage comes, and both parties have to engage together. The reason a scrum is a very dangerous move in rugby, it's a ton of people against another ton of people. And if something goes wrong, someone can get horribly, horribly injured. And most of the injuries in rugby that are really bad happen in the middle of a scrum. And so in today's world, there's that kind of tension in stakeholder engagement. And so we have to think about the intensity of the process and preparing for it. And so there's a couple of rules of the game when we think about stakeholders. Firstly, you cannot engage with stakeholders at a category level. You have to be thinking at a relationship level. What I mean by that is often when we start listing stakeholders, and I've often run workshops where we've listed stakeholders, and it's always the normal ones that come up: suppliers, customers, employees, regulators, maybe government, maybe our landlords. All of those kind of categories of stakeholders almost come up. But the problem is that a stakeholder relationship is a relationship with another party. And so even within a category of stakeholders, there will be different relationships with the different either individuals or different groupings. And so what I often say to people is we've got to get to a useful level of categorization or a useful level of categories. And we do that by understanding that relationships are multidimensional. And the first way to think about a relationship or a stakeholder relationship is that they're at least two-way. They're at least a two-way relationship. And that comes from the definition of stakeholders. And stakeholders are defined as any party that is impacted by the organization as it pursues its strategic objective. along with any party that is able to influence the organization in the pursuit of its strategic objective. And so the key dimensions of those relationships are the impacted and influence. And so there is this, in a relationship, the two ways, and the way to define it is that there is the inside-out relationship, there is the inside-out impact of our business on their business, or our business on them as an individual. And so we have to take into account that dimension, but alongside that, and at the same time, we have to take into account the influence dimension as well. And so a critical part of stakeholder engagement is to think about how do we make sense of some of the challenges that we will be facing. And a critical part of that is to then thirdly say that context is absolutely critical. I must apologize. I have actually been, and I'll make available the slides to you, but I have not been sharing my screen with you, and I'll send you the slides and you'll be able to go through it. Thanks for those who've mentioned that on the chat, and I will also be monitoring more closely, but hopefully you've been able to follow thus far. And so going back, we're at the first stage of identifying stakeholders, and the critical thing to think about is that we need to, in thinking about stakeholders, not do it at a category level, but do it at a relationship level. And the two key elements are impact and influence. And that's what I mean by the definition. So there's the inside out impact, and there's the outside in influence of the stakeholders on us. And then the other key thing is that context is critical. What we mean by that is that at the end of the day, it's about our strategic objective. What I mean, and why this is important, is that it's critical to recognize, and it often sounds a bit tough, but if we don't impact a stakeholder as we pursue our strategic objective, then they are not by definition a stakeholder. If another party is not able to influence us in the achievement of our strategic objective, then it is not a stakeholder, or they're not a stakeholder. And so a critical part of the thinking is that we take the list of stakeholders and we then need to assess or evaluate the actual relationships by scoring them on these two dimensions. And what it looks like when we do that is essentially it's saying we have two columns, impact and influence. I'll just put that as a N, all right? And it's asking ourselves the question, and this is where it's really, really important to have a multidisciplinary group in the team, in the organization together, to say, let's think about what is actually the impact and the influence of these parties. And this is also what helps us. So we may have employees at the top there, but when we start scoring them, we may need to break that into a number of different categories. We may have suppliers, but we need to break that into a number of different categories because the scores that we give them are different. And it's only when we get to the point where we can have a agreement and we've been able to evaluate each of those stakeholders in the same way that we can actually start to create a useful map of stakeholders. For instance, employees, one of the golden rules in a sense of employee relationships and stakeholder thinking is that there's an inverse relationship from top to bottom between impact and influence. The higher up an organization your employees are, and here I'm thinking board, senior management, middle management, the higher their influence on the businesses. And so the higher you would score those people along the influence dimension. But the lower down you go in an organization to your blue collar workers, lower level workers who are far more reliant on the business and their chances potentially of getting work. If something, there was a challenge, the impact would be higher for those people. And so it's stratifying your employees into the right set of levels to score them and evaluate them on impact and influence appropriately. And what that looks like once we put it together is we can then take those parties and we can then map them on a map. We can score them and position them on a map. And these maps are really, really useful in helping us understand the landscape of our businesses. And once we've done that, we can then say, well, what does that mean? And then we start overlaying or start thinking about how do we engage with these stakeholders. And some of the critical questions, as I said, we want to answer here is we want to be able to answer the question, where do we spend time and effort and attention, and how do we actually engage with these people? Who should also have the conversation? Should this be a conversation that we leave to management, or should this be a conversation that we have as decision makers in the process? And so if we start at the bottom and we look at the low impact, low influence, that's a strategy that I call TEL. It's essentially a communicate and monitor strategy. These are stakeholders whose our impact on them is not that significant. They're obviously stakeholders, but not significant in terms of impact. And their influence on the business is not that significant. But we do need to keep them in the loop. The biggest accusation these stakeholders can throw at us is that we didn't tell them. And so the best thing to do is to tell them. And the key thing there with that strategy is that we can communicate with them broadly in groups. So we can say, what are the key groups in that sector, and have strategies that management would run, and we can hold management accountable for those strategies. It's something that could be obviously monitored. We need to monitor stakeholders on an ongoing basis. But the biggest challenge we have there is obviously social media. And so we need to monitor social media and see what are people saying about our businesses. If the impact moves up, the intensity of engagement has to move up. And so I call that actively manage. And this is where the idea is that this would still be primarily a management task. But the idea would be to engage and have specific strategies for each stakeholder, each small group of stakeholders. So there may be a few stakeholders that one has specific strategies to engage with. And if necessary in that block, because here the biggest danger or risk shifts from just social media to the law. And so these people, because of the higher impact of our companies on them, could perceive that the business had harmed them. And if there's perception of harm, then the challenges, it could be taken to the court. And one of the key challenges here, or one of the key principles in terms of this map, is that we do need to be more and more proactive. The further along each of these lines a stakeholder is scored, the more proactive we need to be. In the TEL block, we can be reactive. We can tell them after the fact. We can put things on our website, send a newsletter, those kind of things. All right. But in the actively managed block, and also in the block where the influence is high, we need to be proactive. And in the high influence block, so here are stakeholders. Our impact on them is not so significant, but their influence on us is highly significant. And so for those stakeholders, again, we need specific strategies for each of the stakeholders. Our approach is different, because there we need to be consulting with them. And I call that an ask strategy, because the most important flow of information is from them to us. You see, impact is from us to them. Influence is from them to us. And so here we need to be also positioning the right people to consult at the right level. This is certainly a block that I would retain for decision makers, either senior management or the board, because those are people those are stakeholders whose intentions we need to know beforehand so we can adjust our businesses. So right now, these are the two most important blocks to focus on. I would be putting up, or, apart from, maybe these are the second two most, but together we need to be asking the question, which stakeholders out there are going to be severely negatively impacted by our decisions? Now, remember, we're also in a situation where many of our decisions have been taken away from us. And that's also challenging, because how we position that is a challenge in itself. But we need to ask the question, which of those stakeholders, who's out there? Those could be customers that we are not going to be able to supply to, or they're going to be suppliers that we have to decide not to buy from. But the nature of their business is that they're going to be severely impacted in the actively managed block. And so we need to communicate with them as proactively as possible. Remember I said up front, the liminality, in our approach, we need to be thinking, how do we approach? And I think the approach is down to a matter of days, not months. And in the consult, we need to be asking the question, who can we consult with so that we can, actively understand what other parties are doing going forward. And then in the fourth block, we need to be asking ourselves the question, who do we need to decide together with? Who do we need to actually sit around the table and decide together with? These are critical stakeholders. Our impact on them is high. Their influence on us is high. There's a mutual relationship of a lot of importance. If we get this wrong in this block here, then our businesses, will suffer as well as their businesses will suffer. And so that mapping exercise is aimed at saying, well, who's sitting on that seat? Who are those parties? Who do I need to pick up the phone to and make a call to after this webinar? Other concept to deepen our thinking is to say, well, what are we aiming for in each of these relationships? And what are the elements to think about in each of these relationships? And there are two concepts I want to introduce you to at not a hugely deep level, but to ask the question, as I said, what are we aiming for and what elements to think about in each relationship? And the first concept is called social license. Sounds like quite a technical term, but ultimately it's saying that social license is our relationship with our stakeholders or our pool of stakeholders. And the two dimensions of social license are our social capital. So what is the pool of participants in our network? And here I think it's absolutely critical to pull out the lists of contacts, maybe sit with your team and pull out, and with the map in mind, start thinking about, well, where does the value in our business lie? What's the pool of participants and what are the most important connections in that pool? And that's what the mapping exercise is aimed at doing. But then we also need to understand what is the nature of the relationship and the level of collaboration. And in the theory of social license, there are a number of different levels and boundaries that help us to identify what are we aiming for in each of these relationships. And the key boundaries, the first one, the lowest one, is legitimacy. And below legitimacy, we have a withdrawal. So if we're not legitimate with a certain stakeholder, they will withdraw from us. We see this when companies have people resign en masse. When we saw this with the KPMG, they lost legitimacy in the market, and so clients withdrew from them en masse in South Africa a couple of years ago. Above legitimacy, what we have is acceptance. In other words, acceptance is part of the environment. This is a low level of social license because it's not enough to sustain a relationship, because that distinction between acceptance and withdrawal is not in our control, and there's not enough strength of relationship in that. And so we need to be asking, how do we build credibility? Because we need more than just acceptance, and what credibility gives us with our stakeholders is approval. And so the reason I read that account of that Italian restaurant was because they're looking to rest and rely on their approval in the environment. So they're saying, we are trusting that you'll keep buying from us. That was their opening salvo in this time. But we'll also want to reach out to you. And so they're building on a credibility platform and not just a legitimacy platform. The problem is, in today's world, we also need a higher level, and the highest level of social license is the level of trust. And often we say that we are trusted. I get a bit frustrated when in branding, people talk about the trusted partner. I understand it, but it's not there unless you have, and what it gives you is identification. Is right now we need to be asking the question in our stakeholder groupings is who identifies with us, who is willing to stand alongside us. And obviously it's not there with everybody, but those are the strongest relationships that you need to identify and bring them into your decision-making process. The challenge is that once we've determined what level of we need with each stakeholder, we've got to recognize that there is a greater investment of time and money in the higher levels of social license than the lower levels. And the challenge is, we've got to be brutally honest with ourselves, is where have we invested and where haven't we invested? And this is possibly a question to look as we come out of this time, is to revisit and review, where are we going to spend our investment of time and money and effort in our stakeholder relationships? Because for us to be resilient as businesses, and another phrase that is used is anti-fragile, and the fragility of many businesses is being revealed, we've got to ask the question, how do we see through this as opposed to just get stuck in it? And then the last concept I want to unpack with you is one which is called relational proximity. And this is aimed at answering the question. So social license was aimed at answering the question, what do we want to achieve with our stakeholders that we've mapped? Relational proximity helps us answer the question, what are the dimensions of the relationship? What can we work on in our relationships? And so it's based on this definition of a relationship. You'll see this is also copyrighted. You can explore more if you Google relational analytics. But relationships involve a series of interactions between two individuals or stakeholders, I suppose, who know each other such that each interaction can be influenced by past interactions and by expectations of interactions in the future. So there's a number of different dimensions of a relationship. A relationship exists, coming out of that definition, where there are a series of encounters. And so there's a communication aspect. And remember, here we're trying to answer the question, what do we need to do to build relationships? A series of encounters, communication, shaped by memory and expectation. So there's a past and a future. And so sometimes we need to be going to our stakeholders and reminding them of the storyline. A party that you've just met yesterday, you don't have a relationship with because there's no past. There could be a future, but that relationship is by definition weaker than one where you've dealt with another party for years and years. Where each other is known, where there's information, where the actions of each can affect the other. And this is the power, and this is in a sense the impact influence graph, is that if there is a unweighted or misweighted impact and influence, there could be a problem with the power in the relationship. And within some shared context and motivation, so there needs to be alignment in our relationships. And so in relational proximity, what that means, and here are the key elements to think about, the drivers of relational proximity, and I will put up a slide summarizing the whole concept at the end, is how do we use contact to create an encounter and enable clear and effective communication? What is the directness of this relationship? That's why I said a little bit earlier, I think we need to be asking the question, who must we pick up the phone to, as opposed to just send a mail, connect. Now, obviously that, is going to be something that a lot of us need to do, talk face to face, because that's the most direct you can get is face to face. In today's world, the most direct we can get is a phone call. Continuity, how do we use storyline over a period of time to create a storyline and a sense of momentum and resilience? So what relationships, what stakeholders are out there where we can rely on the continuity of our relationship, where that's strong, where that's something that is robust, and we can continue to maintain momentum and resilience? That's the simple question, is which relationships do we need to protect? Multiplexity is a dimension which talks about the breadth of knowledge. So how wide, a knowledge do we have about our stakeholders? There's stats that came out a few years ago that said that a lot of the times when customers are asked about so if I'm approaching a customer and they've bought one thing from me and I offer 5 things, very, very seldom do they know about the other 4 things. And so the breadth of knowledge about one another is important. Is how wide are we in our knowledge of one another, because that's a critical part. The 2 more, parity, the use of power to promote fairness and enable participation in the relationship. And so we need to be asking the question, earlier on I said, those of us who are strong in business, how can we reach out to stakeholders that we know are weak, but we know have a level of dependency on us and would be, a critical part of our sustainability into the future? Those of us who are weak, how to find a way to talk to, communicate with the strong players in our market. I think there's going to be a time where potentially competitors sit around the table and say, not how do we have anti-competitive behavior, but how do we survive through what the world is going through. And that's the fifth one, commonality, the sharing of purpose and values that create alignment and a sense of synergy and unity. And what this model of relational proximity does is it measures those key elements. But it's a useful tool for asking the question, what do we need to talk about? So if we're picking up the phone to somebody today, tomorrow, this week, are we trying to establish directness because we want to get clarity and connectedness, because it's our clarity of the relationship that we need to work on to ensure sustainability? Are we wanting to continue momentum and resilience? A question that we've often asked is to say, well, which are the relationships that need to continue? Which are the long relationships that will actually help us carry through this time? And how do we treat those relationships? Is it simply about information? Do we need a better mutual understanding? I think that there is an opportunity for there to be more transparency, even if it's transparency in inverted commas behind closed doors, speaking to critical stakeholders, those actively managed stakeholders, those consult stakeholders, being more transparent with our businesses and saying, well, the reason you're critical is because of this is how our business works. We often put up, a whole lot of walls and we hide information. I think this is a time, and obviously it's going to be a challenge. I acknowledge that. But it's a time for mutual understanding. So we recognize our mutual interdependence during this time. Is it a time to walk warily through the power or parity aspects of our relationship? How are we respecting one another? How are we allowing for participation? So those are two ends often of a, so as the low power party in the relationship, we need to continue to respect. But as the high power part in the relationship, we need to ensure participation, because together we'll get through this thing. And then obviously commonality, purpose, values. Maybe it's a conversation that is values-based. It's to say, we believe the same things you believe. Let's work together to create synergy and motivation through this difficult time. And so hopefully that has been an opportunity for you to answer the question, both visually in terms of stakeholder mapping. And apologies again for not turning the screen on early enough, but we'll put the presentation out as well. But you've got the stakeholder mapping. Who should I be picking the phone up to? What should I be talking to them about? If there are any questions or comments, please put them onto the Q&A box. Please put them onto the chat box as we wrap up. And so what I've tried to cover in this webinar is to really ask the question, what are the foundation stones of stakeholder engagement? What are the things that we need to think about? And so we spoke about that concept of liminality, that we are all going through a crisis together. And so the better we prepare, even if we only have a few days to prepare, the better we will be able to go through. But even in our going through, we need to ask the question, how do we move on from this? So a great question to ask as you go into your engagements is to be asking, what is the purpose? What is this thing going to look like on the other side? We then spoke about stakeholder inclusivity, a concept that has been in the governance space for the last 10 or 15 years. How do we include stakeholders in our decision-making process? How do we take them into account? Governing with impact in mind, so that we have to recognize that our policy framework links our decisions to our actions to the impact. And so when we make decisions, we have to think right through all of those. What are we going to do and what will the impact be? We also, on the other side, have to think about our board processes, our decision-making processes, our thinking processes. And that's the board process. That's how often you're going to meet. That's what information gets to your board, in your board pack. It's designing the information. Now, some of these things, we don't want to, in today's crisis, have to create the perfect scenario, but you can all go to version 2 from what you are at the moment. How do you get better information about the stakeholders when you make the decisions up front? And then the key thing about linking board process and policy is that everything we do reflects the impact we have, comes from everything we do, and that reflects the values of the business. And so we spoke in our foundations about some of those challenges. Who's the empty seat at your table when you're making a decision going around the table? Who isn't there, and how do we engage with them? And so the stakeholder mapping process is a visual process, identifies stakeholders at the right level of detail without trying on category level. You cannot engage with stakeholders on category level. You have to engage with stakeholders on a relationship level, impact and influence. Once you've gone through that conversation in your teams, put it on a map and ask the question, which of those that we just have to keep informed? Tell what we're doing. Which of those do we have to actively manage? Which of those do we have to consult with to get information from them because their decision making is going to affect us? Which stakeholders do we need to have around the table when we make a decision? And overlaying that with the concept of social license, do we just have legitimacy, and do we need to do something to build our credibility? Do we need to build trust? So where do we lie on that scale of legitimacy, credibility, trust? Recognizing obviously that trust requires the highest level of investment. And so where do we invest in this time? Do we invest in our communication, making sure we are direct, we are clear, we are constant? One of the golden rules of a crisis is communicate well and communicate often. Secondly, are we just looking for information about one another? So the multiplexity issue. What history do we have to rely on with our stakeholders? And what can we build momentum with in the future? How do we recognize the different power plays in our stakeholder groupings and our relationships with stakeholders? And how do we align? How do we create commonality? How do we create, you know, a joint picture of what this looks like on the other side? So thank you very much for taking the time and attention during this webinar. It will be up on a video as well you'll get, so you'll be able to go through it and pick up on some of the tools, and we'll also be posting the slides for those first few slides that you missed out on. So thank you for taking the time. I see there's no questions or comments. Till next time, signing off.